And this was very much by design. They saw that there was this potential of this alliance between the poor and the dispossessed and racial minorities in the state of Texas, and they did everything that they could to kind of break this movement.
Hey there, I'm Jesse Fox Mayshark, and this is Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. Headlights is a production of the Progressive South, a nonprofit media platform dedicated to amplifying progressive voices and values across the southern United States. You can find out more about us, including how to support our efforts, at our website, theprogressivesouth.org. The voice you heard up top was David Griscom, a Texas native and writer whose new book challenges conventional wisdom about the politics of his home state. We had a good talk about the myth of Red Texas. That's coming up, and later in our Arts and Culture feature, an exhibit that was withdrawn from the National Portrait Gallery arrives in the artist's home state of Georgia. But first, the weekly news roundup. There is, if you haven't noticed, an awful lot going on politically these days, even as we head into the usually slower summer news season. As always, you can find sources and links with more information in the show notes. This week, we'll catch up on the federal prosecution of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and close to home for me, the banning from school libraries of Alex Haley's classic novel Roots. To start with, though, the state of play of Southern redistricting efforts in the wake of the Supreme Court's Louisiana versus Cowboy decision. Last week, of course, we took a deep dive on the battle in Tennessee for Memphis's congressional district, now chopped up to create a new majority-white district that will likely elect a Republican this fall. Tennessee was first past the finish line in dismantling its majority-black district, completing the evisceration just 8 days after the Supreme Court ruling, but Louisiana and Alabama are close on its heels. In Louisiana, the state that gave rise to the Cowboy case, Republican Governor Jeff Landry immediately suspended primary voting for congressional races that had already started and called the legislature into a special session for redistricting. That was nearing a conclusion at the end of last week, with the Republican-dominated state House and Senate working out details of the new districts. They appear certain to dissolve one of the state's 2 black-majority congressional districts, which was at issue in the Supreme Court decision. Alabama has had a trickier path. Like Louisiana, the state drew a congressional map after the 2020 census that was ruled unconstitutional by federal courts, which ordered it to allow for more black representation. Like Louisiana, Alabama added a second congressional district with a large black population, which created a second Democratic seat in the state. Now it would like to return to its original map that was thrown out in 2023. But unlike Louisiana, Alabama had not had those prior court rulings overturned. So the first thing Governor Kay Ivey and other Republican officials had to do was petition the Supreme Court to lift the order that had created the new maps. The court did that quickly, acting on May 11th to send the case back to lower courts for reconsideration in light of the Cowboy decision. The legislature came back into special session and quickly passed bills to essentially disregard the results of the May 19th party primaries for 4 of the state's 7 congressional seats, and set a new August primary in anticipation of its older maps. It is on hold for the moment, pending action by the lower courts. The Alabama case was somewhat different in its facts and findings than the Louisiana case, so it's not automatically certain that the court that found the old map discriminatory will now decide it's fine. Last week, Republican Senator Tommy Tuberville, who's running for Alabama governor this year, seemed to throw a little cold water on the expectation that the map will be reset. He told reporters, quote, "I'm not so sure it's going to go through. I haven't looked at it that much," unquote. Different complicating factors have restrained neighboring Mississippi from joining the congressional redistricting fray this year. But the state's Republicans did notch a Cowboy-related win last week when the U.S. Supreme Court lifted another court order, which had forced the state to draw more black-majority state legislative seats in 2025. Those led to the elections last year of 2 more black Democratic state Senate members, breaking the body's Republican supermajority, and 1 more black House Democrat. The Supreme Court's ruling sent those districts back to the lower court for reconsideration. Mississippi Republicans are hopeful that means they will be able to revert to their prior, whiter, more Republican-friendly map. Governor Tate Reeves has also made clear that next year the legislature will look at carving up its black-majority state legislative districts and its one black-majority congressional seat. South Carolina Republicans, meanwhile, have been going back and forth on whether to redraw the state's congressional districts this year. There's currently one majority black district in the state, held by its only Democratic Congressman, Jim Clyburn. Republicans in the state Senate initially resisted undertaking the redrawing this year, but Governor Henry McMaster called them back into a special session with the explicit goal of eliminating Clyburn's seat. The state House moved quickly last week, passing a new all-Republican map in a midnight session, but its outlook in the Senate remains unclear. Texas, Florida, and North Carolina had all already drawn more Republican-friendly congressional districts before the Callais decision came down. All four of Arkansas's congressional districts are already held by Republicans, so there's nothing more for them to gain there. And Georgia Governor Brian Kemp has called a special redistricting session to begin June 1st, but it won't affect the 2026 elections. Kemp wants new congressional and state legislative districts drawn ahead of the 2028 elections. That is certain to be a fierce fight in one of the South's most politically divided states. With so much else going on in recent weeks, we haven't even talked about the criminal charges filed by the U.S. Department of Justice against the Southern Poverty Law Center. The SPLC, based in Montgomery, Alabama, is, of course, a storied institution, a legal advocacy nonprofit founded in 1971 to pursue civil rights and public interest litigation. It went through a rocky spell last decade with the ouster of co-founder Morris Dees over complaints from staff about inappropriate behavior. That shakeup, which also included the resignations of the president and legal director, led to a reevaluation of the organization's goals and approaches. For decades, it had focused its energy on identifying and bringing lawsuits against white supremacists and other extremist groups. It is now taking a more holistic approach to promoting civil rights across the Deep South, including lobbying in state legislatures and supporting candidates in local races. We featured an interview with Brandon Jones of the SPLC's Action Fund back in Episode 8, which is linked in the show notes. The SPLC has long been an irritant to the political right, not least because of its maintenance of lists of identified hate groups, which include prominent conservative organizations like the American Family Association, the Alliance Defending Freedom, and Moms for Liberty. On April 21st, the Trump administration's Justice Department announced it had indicted the SPLC on 11 counts of wire fraud, false statements, and bank fraud. The charges revolve around the organization's practice in years past of paying informants inside white supremacist groups, secret payments that the feds have painted as sinister deceptions of the SPLC's donors. But federal officials have also overstated what the charges actually say. In the press release announcing the indictments, Acting U.S. Attorney General Todd Blanche said, "The SPLC is manufacturing racism to justify its existence," unquote, implying that the organization was deliberately funding hate groups in order to raise alarms about them, as opposed to paying for information about their operations. President Donald Trump went even further, as he tends to, calling the SPLC a Democrat hoax in a late-night social media post, and, for somewhat unclear reasons, asserting that if it is convicted of the charges, quote, "the 2020 presidential election should be permanently wiped from the books," unquote. Something he has, of course, been trying to do ever since that election. The charges don't come close to even making those kinds of allegations. The gist of the actual case is that the SPLC used its own money to pay people who were members of hate groups in exchange for information, knowing that those same sources were involved in public and private white supremacist efforts. In order to turn those otherwise legal arrangements into alleged criminal conspiracies, the Justice Department asserts that they amounted to defrauding both the SPLC's contributors, who didn't know where some of their money was going, and the banks where they set up accounts to handle the payments. The SPLC has fiercely denied the charges and is fighting them in court. It has pushed back against statements by Blanche that the organization never provided information to the FBI or other authorities about any illegal activities it learned about from its informants. Brian Fair, the SPLC's interim CEO, said, quote, "The information that the SPLC shared with the FBI over the last 40 years saved lives. When threats and other unlawful activity were revealed, the SPLC immediately passed that information to law enforcement officials, local, state, and federal, and assisted in efforts to prevent violence and stop criminal activity," unquote. Many other civil rights organizations have denounced the charges as an attempt by the Trump administration to bully an ideological adversary. Last week, the ACLU said in a statement, quote, "The Trump administration may be prosecuting SPLC now, but make no mistake, this affects all of us. Once the government is allowed to punish critics and go after groups for their views, none of us is safe from those in power now or in the future. If we value our freedom, we must draw a line," unquote. Legal observers have not been impressed with either the charges or the way federal officials have exaggerated them in public statements. The nonprofit legal affairs website Lawfare wrote an analysis that found, quote, "gaping legal holes," unquote, in the case, and warned, quote, "no good can come from corrupting the criminal justice system with this kind of politically motivated abuse." And now I'm going to bring things right back home here to Knoxville, Tennessee, where earlier this month we all learned that our local school district, Knox County Schools, has added a few titles to its banned books list. One of them is Roots, the Pulitzer Prize-winning best-selling 1976 novel by the late Alex Haley. This was not the first classic novel to be removed from local shelves under a 2022 state law called the Age-Appropriate Materials Act. Others have included Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut and The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. But none of those generated the kind of attention that the removal of Roots did. It sprang quickly from local to statewide headlines and then went international with coverage from the British newspaper The Guardian. The decision has been widely assailed as wrong-headed and racist, not surprisingly given the book's multi-generational saga of a black family from Africa through slavery and the Jim Crow era to the civil rights movement. District officials said they were just trying to follow the law. The Age-Appropriate Materials Act identifies some specific topic areas, depictions of nudity and descriptions of sexual conduct, excessive violence, or sadomasochistic abuse, that, if they are present on even one page or in even one paragraph, render a book unfit for any grade level from K to 12. Districts across Tennessee have been left to interpret the law, with some removing hundreds of books from school libraries and others none at all. Knox County's in the middle, with 124 books removed so far. Officials said the removal of Roots came after somebody, a school librarian, student, parent, or other staff member, as allowed by the law, flagged a particular passage as violating the sadomasochistic abuse standard. The passage describes the brutal rape of an enslaved woman by a slave owner. Under the law, the content has to be considered entirely on its own, without regard to the context or cultural significance of the book. It was, in fact, the second time that somebody had submitted a passage from Roots to the district's review committee. The first time, the committee ruled the book was not in violation. In any case, its removal has prompted a public outcry, and school board members are planning next month to discuss ways to allow for review and reinstatement of banned books, something the law does not provide a framework for but doesn't appear to explicitly prohibit. As a work of alleged family history, Roots has come under scrutiny in the decades since its publication. Some historians have questioned Haley's assertions that he was able to trace his own family as specifically as the book made it appear, although, to be fair, he did publish it as fiction. He was also accused of plagiarism of some passages and settled a related lawsuit. But its presence as a cultural touchstone has survived those controversies because it helped generations of Americans, of all races, understand the full arc of the African American experience. It's not the first time Roots has been banned. According to the writers group PEN America, 2 school districts in Iowa also removed it in recent years. But it has particular resonance here in Knoxville. Haley spent part of his childhood in Tennessee, and later in life he actually moved here to East Tennessee, buying a small farm just a little north of Knoxville. He was a notable presence here, and he is honored with a large statue in a public park in a predominantly black neighborhood. Even retired Republican Senator Lamar Alexander has come out against the removal of the book, calling it a mistake. But even if the school board finds a way to bring back Roots, the reality is that the state law remains in effect unless or until the Republican supermajority in the legislature decides to change it. In the 4 years since its passage, Tennessee has rocketed toward the top of the banned books list, ranking 3rd nationally for total volumes removed from school libraries, behind only Florida and Texas. Okay, now we're to my interview with David Griscom. He is a Texas native and a prominent voice on the left. He contributes regularly to the socialist magazine Jacobin and hosts 2 podcasts, The Jacobin Show and Left Reckoning. He has published a really interesting new book called The Myth of Red Texas: Cowboys, Populism, and Class War in the Radical South. It traces political movements on the left in Texas from the late 1800s through the middle of the 20th century, and argues that attempts to paint Texas as a historical landscape of rugged individualism and ruthless capitalism leave out much of the picture. We had a great conversation. So, Seth, let's go to the tape.
David Griscom, thanks so much for joining me.
Really happy to be here.
So you've written this terrific book, The Myth of Red Texas, which I highly recommend to anybody who wants to complicate your understanding of Texas, because I kind of feel like no matter how much you know about Texas, this book is going to tell you some things and tell you about some people and events that you're not familiar with. To start out, first, you are a Texas native yourself, right?
Yeah, I'm from Austin.
And so when you talk about the myth of Red Texas, I'm just curious to what degree you yourself grew up with that myth of Red Texas. Like, what was your sense of Texas politically, growing up there, going to Texas schools and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I'm one of those kids who every year for my birthday I'd go to San Antonio to go see the Alamo. So I very much grew up with a very kind of strong sense of myself as a Texan and kind of Texas history and Texas culture. I was born at the kind of the tail end of the Democratic Party control of the state. I was born in 1992, so I'm seeing the end. I was kind of born into the end of of like Ann Richards and of like really major Democratic Party politicians in the state of Texas. So, my first politicians were, W. So I kind of grew up in this period of time of Republican domination of the state. And, being from Austin, there's always this kind of sense of like, things are happening to us and we're not really acting, if that makes sense. I think that kind of leads people down a bad kind of political path to refusing to kind of understand the reasons why things are the way that they are. But yeah, there was always this kind of idea that like, the real Texas, right? The Texas outside of the cities, the soul of it is like, yes, this kind of more Republican, more conservative, way of being. As I get older and I start studying and learning more about Texas history, particularly Texas's earlier history, you find that that's a very complicated idea. And I would also just like add, and I think this is true of many places in the South, not just in Texas, that there are these kind of values that feel shared across the board that are fairly solidaristic, that are fairly friendly. I write about neighborliness a lot in the book as a kind of stand-in for solidarity because I find those to be Texan values, and I think that they're just as much a part of the fabric of the state as anything else.
Right. Well, and so in the book, you dive into this, and as you say, like these histories and stories that you tell of various labor and populist movements. These are not urban cosmopolitan movements. These are movements that come from the rural parts of the state and the working people of the state. I just kind of wanted to hit on a couple of them, and the book is full of really fascinating and detailed stories. And so, for people who really want to understand this, I very much recommend delving into it. It's also a quick read, so it's very well written. But you start the book with the Cowboy Strikers, and I think that is a really interesting story, and it's also really interesting in the way I think it kind of challenges our ideas about cowboys and the way that the cowboy trope has been used over time, as you talk about, as this kind of like symbol of the rugged individualist, conquering the wilderness. Who were the Cowboy Strikers, and what did they do? And also, in your work, like you did a good job of teasing out that there's kind of been this story that the Cowboy Strike was a failure, and you show that not so much, maybe.
Yeah. No, I mean, I find this, the story is really interesting, and there's a great book that goes in depth on not just this strike, but also goes across the West, written by Mark Laus, called The Great Cowboy Strike. But it's a very interesting tale. So the quick version of it is that, there's an old way of doing cowboy work, and Texas doesn't have a lot of money, but it has a lot of land and it has a lot of cattle. And traditionally, working cowboys were able to kind of claim mavericks, and mavericks are wild cattle. That there was much of it in Texas. That's why Texas became such a beef state at this period of time. And for a long time, the working cowboys, the people who were hired, would be able to claim those, and it allowed them to kind of build up their own herd. This is a time when a lot of new people are coming to Texas. Obviously, a lot of migrants, people from the South, people from the rest of the world, but also a lot of Northern and European capital starts coming to Texas. And they start to see this old tradition as creating competition for themselves. So they first start to ban mavericking. And also basically enforce a kind of wage labor standard on cowboy work, which, kind of existed in a place in between, more ancient agreements between, boss and worker, and the kind of more industrial style that ends up taking over and winning out here. So at first the cowboys, start, organizing themselves, and they have this big meeting where they demand basically a wage floor for all cowboy work. They also do stipulate a wage floor for a good cook. I do not know how much a bad cook would be paid. But they start demanding, that there is at least a certain standard of wage for cowboy work. And this is important because the leaders of the cowboy strike actually were what were called wagon bosses. And these were people just, without getting too much into the weeds, these are people who interfaced with the bosses, they interfaced with the merchants, and they were at the higher end of the wage scale. So the people who were leading the strike and really getting it organized were actually people who wouldn't necessarily benefit, like they weren't fighting for a raise. They were fighting to basically protect this industry and the other workers, which is, something that, I find to be endlessly fascinating. Anyways, the Cowboys, they go on strike. It's a pretty significant strike. And for anybody who has read, books like Lonesome Dove or knows anything about these kind of romantic stories of the cattle drive, I mean, this was the kind of work that they were doing. They would be taking the cattle from Tuscosa, Texas, up in the Panhandle to Dodge City in Kansas. And one of the things that's important is that you want to get your cattle to market first. So if you wait too long, you're going to, get a lower price for what you're delivering. So it's a kind of a race against the clock. And this is why the cowboy strike is so interesting, because in addition to them being very good at kind of organizing and bringing in a lot of different workers here, they also understand the kind of strategic aspect of going on strike. They go on strike right as the cattle drive is about to begin. And so I'll set this up there. This is the kind of the setup, and I'll tell you all how you will read about this if you oftentimes read about Texas history. In fact, it was just May Day, and usually some newspaper man across the state will write a short essay about the cowboy strike. And the story always goes like this. In Tuscosa, Texas, a bunch of cowboys got together, and they organized a union. And then and they went on strike, but they went to the saloon, and they spent all their strike fund, and they walked back to the bosses, hat in hand, and continued to work. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the cowboy strike was such a success. I mean, it seems like they won that strike in a matter of days. And again, you can read official U.S. government statistics that list this as a strike that occurred and list the wages that were demanded by the workers as what they ended up receiving. What ends up happening here is not so much that the Cowboys win the strike, they get their demands met, but over the long term, over the next few years, the employers start using the blacklist. They start, refusing to hire certain people who participated in the strike. And this is not a story that is unique to Texas or a story that is unique to cowboy work. This is something that goes on across American labor. And the point that I get to in the book here is like, hey, this is an interesting labor story. It is true that they don't win in like the largest sense, that like the industry is saved and, it doesn't change. This kind of work does end up disappearing in Texas. But instead of this being seen, the way that this is always said is like, hey, this is why labor unions can't work with cowboys, because cowboys are individualistic who could never be in a labor union, when in fact what happened with the cowboy strike and what happened with the cowboy labor union was the same thing that happens in every under industry. The bosses use duplicitous tactics to try to undercut them. They try to break solidarity. So this is a story that just it fits just as much in with the other labor struggles of the time, as the railroad strikes, as all these other movements, as the mine workers strikes, as anything else that's going on. But for some reason, when it comes to the cowboys, we get told this myth and this story that it could never work there because there's something about working on horseback that, makes you not look out for your neighbor.
Right, which of course, like if you actually think about, or even if you've just seen Lonesome Dove, this was in fact collective work. It wasn't like you can only run a cattle drive if everybody's working together, and it's a communal effort to get
100%.
from here to there. And so then your book moves into the growth of what came to be called sort of broadly prairie populism, but really had its birth in Texas. In these fights over land, which so much of our politics ends up being about one way or another. And without going into, and again, this became not just a Texas, but a national movement that had real ramifications, especially for the Democratic Party in the late 19th century into the early 20th century. You get to a point in the story where the Texas People's Party, which is essentially the populist movement, has risen to a level where it's really competing significantly with the established political parties. And so can you just kind of talk about that moment a bit? Like, what did it take, including the fact that this was a multiracial effort, what did it take to get to that point? And then kind of how was it beaten back?
Yeah, I mean, it is really fascinating, and especially how quickly it moved. I mean, there's a decent amount of prehistory here, but let's just kind of cut to the main aspects here. One of the big things is most people who are working in Texas at this period of time, even though we do think of like cattle ranching and all this kind of stuff as what Texas economy is based on, and it was like many other places, cotton was king. And most of the people who were working in Texas were working as growing cotton, and you just see this massive explosion of a new class of people, these tenant farmers. And this was a system that was set up, yes, one by poverty and the fact that a lot of people are moving into Texas, but two because we have this very predatory banking and finance system existing in Texas, and it exists like this across the South. If you know anything about farming, at the beginning of the season, you oftentimes have to borrow a lot of money to get all the materials that you need. Texas, again, was also very cash poor, so prices in Texas for everything was pretty high. So people would obviously they would take loans out to get the materials that they need. But if your wife wants a dress, if you want to have fat back for cooking, you would also go to the same store and you would take out a loan. And that loan was against your future earnings. And it just so happened that every year when after harvest, you'd go up and the merchant would tally up the amount of cotton that you delivered and your debts, and you would oftentimes find yourself going to the next year in debt. And it was so bad that you had a significant portion of Texan farmers who may have been born on a plot of land that their family owned and ended up being tenants renting the land because the merchant basically took it from under their feet. So this is just, an experience of poverty, a sense of that people can't get out of the system, and a real kind of, interruption of like the kind of political and economic system into people's, basic lives. So you start asking yourself, well, how the hell do we get out of this? At first, they organized themselves into these groups called the Southern Alliance, Southern Farmers Alliance. And they start looking, hey, should we be doing crop diversification, modernizing our farming techniques? And at a certain point, if it's the finance system that is screwing you over, it doesn't matter, what kind of farming techniques you use. So they started trying to organize themselves into this cooperative movement, to start having cooperative run stores, maybe doing things like pooling their cotton together so that they could sell as a group. But there's this entire period in the 1880s where they're trying this, and basically the merchant class and the banker class, they refuse to play ball. They kind of, again, they do things like blacklist. They won't sell or buy from these cooperatives. So the farmers start to realize, hey, we're going to need to get involved in politics because the politicians are in bed with the same class as well as in bed with the railroads. So they organize themselves into, this third party movement. They're at first like kind of influential as a pressure group in and around the Democratic Party. That's how James Hogg gets elected governor of Texas, puts in place something called the Railroad Commission, which is still a very powerful organization here. But he very quickly realizes that he doesn't want to deal with a bunch of upstart farmers who are demanding more of him. So he wages war on the populist faction within the Democratic Party, which then allows the independent movement that had existed before then to really explode, because anyone who's a populist ends up joining up. And, they ran on the extremely progressive planks. Frankly, you can look at their platform, and I lay out a lot of it in the book. It looks fairly similar to something that, Bernard Sanders ran on when he ran for president. There's a kind of form of, there's, anti-convict labor. There's demands for labor unions to be recognized. There's demands on regulations on capital. And there's also, I think, very importantly, the demand for public ownership of major industries in Texas. So in a few short years, the populists go from a nothing party to the second major party in Texas. They're led by this they're led by very charismatic figures like a fellow named Nugent, who was, a long-haired, whiskered man. But he ends up dying before the 1896 election. And I bring that up just because the 1896 election is actually the kind of watershed moment. It's the year that they do the best. And the fact that you could have your figurehead pass away right before that election and still do well shows that it wasn't just the kind of a populism that was led by one charismatic leader, but actually a populism that had deep roots within the community. The 1896 election, myself and others argue that was effectively stolen. And this isn't just, sour grapes after the fact. The Democratic Party was stuffing ballots. We have plenty of examples that I get into in the book of, armed men standing outside of the polling places and basically intimidating people who they thought would be populist voters, obviously including black voters as well. Also in heavily black communities, there's also plenty of suspicions about the voting patterns that were going on in those communities, leading many to believe that those are probably stuffed and altered ballots. And the official tally puts the populist in second place by only about 40,000 votes. And just like the scale, the scope, and the organization of the fraud has led many people to believe that election itself was stolen. The populists are an interesting group at this period of time because it is 100% correct and important to remember that this wasn't some kind of like racially utopian movement, but it was a movement that appealed to poor whites and poor working class black people on the basis of their shared economic condition, which meant that it brought in many, many black voters. And the more progressive wing of the populist movement was very adamant about trying to build out this movement amongst black Texans. And the fact that they're able to win so many voters from the Republican Party kind of speaks to this. So, they're able to bring in, at least have the threat for the Democratic Party that they're going to start having this kind of coalition between, black Texans and poor farmers and poor working class whites. And the kind of immediate aftermath of this 1896 election is this massive restriction of the vote in Texas, which certainly was targeted at African Americans, but it also was targeted at poor whites as well. Things like the poll tax, literacy also disenfranchised, white people as well. And this was very much by design. They saw that there was this potential of this alliance between the poor and the dispossessed and racial minorities in the state of Texas, and they did everything that they could to kind of break this movement.
And you go in the book then from there into the really fascinating history of the Texas Socialist Party, which I won't ask you about here because it's another entire narrative. But it is really interesting that at a certain point in time, Texas had one of the largest socialist parties in the country, and had its own sort of peak and subsidence. The other just kind of story I wanted to ask you to bring out a little bit is Emma Tenayuka, who becomes a significant figure sort of in the New Deal era as a very young labor leader in the pecan industry. Who was Emma Tenayuka and what did she do?
I mean, she was, an incredible figure, and it's interesting. There's been a kind of resurgence in interest in her, which thank the Lord. But it is surprising that she had been kind of forgotten by many people for so long. She was this incredible labor organizer and radical who I write about her in the book in the connection to all of these stories happening in the 1800s because there's a through line to Emma Tenayuka from all of this kind of prehistory about Texas, this kind of political history, because she was taught by kind of veterans of the Texas Socialist Party, who were taught by veterans of the Texas Populist Movement, who were taught by veterans of the fence cutters and the Cowboy Strikers. So there's a through line to her that I think is really interesting in the way that she kind of embodies this tradition. But what's happening in Texas is, the pecan industry is a massive industry in the state of Texas. It's incredibly difficult work. It's also kind of contracted out. So people are doing this at home or at like kind of smaller facilities instead of like one big factory. But the working conditions are horrendous. People are, there's a lot of debris in the air basically, and it really can destroy your lungs, shelling pecans at the rate and the frequency that they're doing. So she starts organizing, the pecan workers, for fair wages. And what's interesting about it is that it has a lot of parallels to today. A lot of these workers were migrant workers or had, kind of maybe questionable or contestable immigration status in the U.S. And that was something that was used by the bosses to kind of keep them in line and threaten them. So by organizing the strike, which again was organized in a very clever way, it wasn't just like at one place, one time. They were doing a kind of like sit-down strike situation where they were moving from facility to facility and shutting it down so that the bosses didn't know where to act, where to send the cops, who to come after. But she gets kind of self-selected or got selected by the community as the leader of the strike, again, as just a young woman, I believe 21 years old at the time of the strike. And the strike is massively threatening to the powers that be. You have the mayor and the police really coming at these folks because in addition to the demands for the pecan shellers, there are also just these demands for recognition of the Mexican-American community in San Antonio as full citizens. A lot of the New Deal programs had excluded or weren't being extended, at least by the managers and the facilitators to these workers. So there was a worry that the pecan sheller strike could go beyond just the pecan shellers into kind of like an outright rebellion against against the status quo. It's an interesting thing because unlike other strikes, the pecan industry was not a story of mechanization taking jobs. It was a recognition from the bosses that they could pay such low wages to these laborers that it would be cheaper than using machines to do this kind of work. So just to make it clear, this is like hyper exploitative stuff. They're paying these people nothing. The pecan sheller strikes is a massive strike. It's one of the largest in Texas's history. And again, initially they win. In the long term, the pecan industry starts to decline in Texas after this period. But Emma Tenayuka is a major figure in Texas labor history and the kind of figure who fought for the folks who were left behind. And I get into it a lot in the book. But beyond just how good she was as a labor organizer, she's just a really incredible, I think, political thinker. And somebody who people could learn a lot from. She really, I think, in many ways shows, what the best of us could look like.
Including, at one point, she actually stepped down from the formal leadership because she became sort of a lightning rod herself, and she understood that strategically it would be better for her to not be the front person, right?
Yeah, no, I know this is a fast. So again, she gets the crowd really just yells her name at the beginning of the strike, Emma, and that's how she becomes the leader. But as you were noting, yes, she becomes controversial, or at least she knows that the state is maybe going to use her background to come at her. She had been a member of the Communist Party, and when she realized that they were going to kind of use this to distract or harm the strike, she just steps down. But unlike a lot of other people who organized in the kind of limelight and are well known, she was very happy to also be the person standing on the side of the road with a clipboard and making signs and doing that hard work of organizing. That's not delivering the big speech or being the figurehead of the movement. She really was of it in such a way that she just steps to the side and then continued to work and be a major help to the movement, even though she wasn't necessarily leading it anymore.
Yeah. Well, so in the book and in your introduction and conclusion, you kind of put all this in the frame of contemporary Texas politics up to and including the 2024 elections. And you talk about the shift of Texas from being a more democratic state to now a solidly red Republican state, at least the way the maps are drawn. I guess, what is your takeaway for the present moment? Because I feel like, obviously you're very committed to and interested in organizing and building political power on the left. What did you absorb from these histories that you think are instructive for the current moment, broadly, but in Texas specifically?
I think the first thing, and again, I think this book has a lot of lessons even for people who aren't Texans or interested in Texas in particular. What it does is it sets us up at a time that I think is very similar to today. We don't have the kind of union density that I think many people on the left would like. We don't have like this kind of strong social and political organizations that we used to either. So in many ways, we're closer to those like 1870s, 1880s farmers trying to figure out what are the kind of economic solutions and economic demands that can build this coalition. I write in the book, there's always kind of debates on the left about what the best political strategy is. Should you have people run within the Democratic Party and try to change that party from the inside? Should you run from the outside, et cetera, et cetera? And I get, and I've engaged in those debates. I know that they're interesting, but when you look at the history, I find what matters more is whether or not you actually have like an organized and a coherent group of people. Like, to have the People's Party, you first need to have people thinking of themselves as populists, as part of the people's movement. And I think that that's something that is just very much missing, I think, from politics today. And I think that, looking at this history, it makes it abundantly clear that there was no kind of specific one single strategy, as much as there was the need to kind of bring people into the movement. And the other thing that I think that ended up being very effective at this time was, the role of kind of economic populism and organizing around shared economic interests. This was a period of time, I don't need to tell anybody this was a period of time that had massive kind of, racial separation, and brutality and wickedness and evil. But what ended up being one of the more effective tools to fight against this was actually people organizing around those shared economic interests, that actually created, the kind of levels of solidarity that were needed to take it on. And Texas today is a big state. It's changing a lot, and much like at this time that I was writing about in the book, we're also wondering who we are as Texans and what does that mean. The same period, the period of time in the book is also a period of like mass migration from within the U.S. into Texas. So today, as we're trying to build up our movements, I think being able to reconnect with this specific history is important, one, for the lessons, but two, to kind of debunk, quote unquote, the myth of red Texas. Texas is one of the largest economies in the world. And our Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, who's from Maryland, by the way, is spending a lot of his time waging war on the Alamo Museum and getting people fired from the Alamo Museum for doing wokeness or whatever. Totally laughable and like silly in many ways, but also, why is the lieutenant governor so fixated on this? Well, it's because this myth of red Texas, I think, is really important for them and their politics, because if you associate being a Texan with voting for the Republican Party, it allows these new Texans who move here to feel like, they're part of the system. They've joined the state and its history. I get into this in the book, but a big part of the flip in Texas that happened between the Democrat and Republican Party was the fact that Texas became one of like the most moved to places in the U.S. There's massive amounts of corporate relocation in the 80s and 90s, and most of those people who were moving here from California and New York were very happy to vote for the Republican Party, and the Republicans were very open about this. So this myth of red Texas, of actually trying to like give people this story about themselves, this story about themselves, ends up being really helpful for the Republican Party, which is why they work so hard to maintain it.
Yeah, which obviously you're also seeing with the curricular interest in all of Texas's higher learning institutions, also focused on presenting a very narrow view of Texan history, American history, for the same purpose. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap it up. I'll just recommend, again, that everybody read the book. I'll link to it in the show notes. And thanks for writing it. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jesse. I really had a good time.
Amy Sherald has come home. The acclaimed painter, a native of Columbus, Georgia, has brought her career retrospective exhibition, American Sublime, to the High Museum in Atlanta. Sherald is an African-American artist who specializes in striking portraits of black people against simple but colorful backgrounds. She has close connections to Atlanta. She graduated from Clark Atlanta University, and in 2018, the High Museum awarded her its annual David C. Driscoll Prize in African American Art and Art History. She's 52 years old. Her profile rose in 2017 when Michelle Obama selected her to paint her official First Lady portrait, which hangs in the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. The National Portrait Gallery has become somewhat fraught terrain for Sherald. In 2016, she became the first woman and first African-American artist to win the gallery's Outwin Butchever portrait competition with her painting Miss Everything, Unsuppressed Deliverance. The American Sublime show was first exhibited at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art in 2024. It was scheduled to arrive at the National Portrait Gallery for an extended stay last fall. But after the second Trump administration took office last year and began an ideological crackdown on the Smithsonian museums, Sherald announced she was withdrawing the exhibition. At particular issue was the inclusion of a painting called Transforming Liberty, showing a transgender black woman posed as the Statue of Liberty. The portrait gallery had proposed replacing the painting with a video of people reacting to it, including people with anti-trans views. In a letter to the gallery, Sherald wrote, quote, "I entered into this collaboration in good faith, believing that the institution shared a commitment to presenting work that reflects the full, complex truth of American life. Unfortunately, it has become clear that the conditions no longer support the integrity of the work as conceived," unquote. The Trump administration declared victory over the withdrawal, calling the Statue of Liberty painting divisive and ideological. Instead of Washington, D.C., Sherald took the exhibition to the Baltimore Museum of Art over the winter. This month it opened at the High Museum, where it will be on display through September 27th. Sherald has had work displayed at the High before, including her portrait of Michelle Obama. But this is her first solo exhibition at the most prestigious art museum in her home state. If you want to visit, the High recommends booking timed tickets in advance. It's expecting crowds. And that wraps us up for this week. Remember, the Progressive South is a nonprofit enterprise, and you can find information about supporting us on our website, theprogressivesouth.org. You can also reach out to me directly at jmayshark@theprogressivesouth.org. Thanks to our friends in Bark for our theme music, and to Lord Seth the Libertarian for his production work at Barbarian Productions. And thanks to you for listening. We'll talk to you soon.